Hello and welcome to another developer toolkit. So this time around we're going to be taking a look at how we can build a look to interact system for a first person game. So what we're talking about here is something where we can look at an object where it can display a prompt to us indicating what we're actually able to do with it, and then being able to press a key, provide some input to do that interaction. And so there's a lot of different elements that we want to implement with that, so that identifying of what we're looking at, that being able to show a tooltip or other information there, and also being able to have a couple of different options in terms of our interactions, whether that's a one-shot thing of you press the interact key and then it immediately completes the interaction, or where you can hold down that interaction key for a time for it to actually perform the particular interaction there. So let's get started. So we've got a base here, which is first person one, where we've got the ability for character to move around, and this is where we're going to be setting up our interaction within. So we need some things we can interact with. So let's get this set up. I'm going to place a sphere, and let's bring this over here. I'm going to move this over just to here. Oops, -15 and 5. So I'm going to have a couple of different interacts, but we want to set up our general sort of structure for this first. So I'm going to give this a empty parent. So this is going to be our interactable. And so we will have under this the visual mesh, or the object. It's the actual object itself. So just want to set up a little bit of a hierarchy with this. So that object, we can reposition that then. So this just means our interactable, if we place the actual position of the interactable on the ground, then everything nicely appears above that. So that looks good. The sphere, I'm actually going to shrink in size a bit. So I'll actually lower that. Now this is going to have some UI. So I might as well block that out as well now. And again, that's something where what I'm going to do is just create an empty object where this is going to be the UI. And this is where what I would use for this is once I add in the canvas, which I'll just add in a panel to start because it'll bring in the canvas anyway. Prompt. So this is going to be a world space UI. So what I want to do here is change the UI scale mode, can stay as that, but the render mode changes to world space. Now, really important thing with this is, and I'm just going to reset these positions so it's positioned appropriately. Now we notice this is gigantic. Now your first instinct with this might be, okay, I'm going to set the width to something really small. That's generally going to be the first instinct people will have with this, and I really recommend against that. Set this to something, a width and height that's an appropriate amount, feels like an appropriate amount of pixels. The reason being, if I have this of a width and a height of say 1 meter by 1 meter, then that means I might have a button in there and its height might be 0.1 or 0.15 and things like that. You start to get to really low values and it can become really hard for actually positioning things with that scale difference. So I generally, with these, I would recommend having a width and height that feels about right in pixels, and then this scale is what I would typically change. So I would start with just getting some initial values in there. Well, 1/100th doesn't look like enough, but I could divide that by, say, 4, and that feels about right. So I just apply these scales over. Doesn't really matter for the Z, but just for consistency, I usually would. So that looks pretty good. I'm happy with that. Means I can also then adjust where this is sort of positioned. So my prompt there, I can move that up and about 1 meter. This would change depending on the particular object as well. And we can also adjust the pivot there. So that looks good. So I'm pretty happy with that positioning. I might lower the height a little bit. I think a 4:3 aspect ratio is probably pretty good for this. So that's looking all right. Then what I would be able to do is I would also then be able to set up under my panel here. Well, let's configure this. I'm going to change the tinting so it actually goes for darkening the background behind it. That's going to stand out a lot better with the particular environment that I've got here. Again, we can be changing that depending on circumstances. So I've got my panel. Let's split this up to have a few different components to it. So I am actually going to set up another panel here that this one is going to have in it the title. So this is our front panel item name, or object name, I think is a better term. Object name panel. And then we just create our TextMesh Pro entry in there for the object name. Now, one of the things we'll notice is this is rotated. So this is something where we've got different places where we could actually fix this. I could change it on my panel there, which works. That just allows me to, the reason I'm changing it on that and not on something like the prompt is I want to be able to rotate this tooltip. And with how I've got it set up at the moment, I can easily tilt this to get having it face the player, which is one of the things I will end up setting up. So that's why I wanted to rotate the panel, not its parent, because that prompt, and that's also why I changed the pivot point there, because now I can just very easily do a look rotation to be able to work out which way to face. So that looks good. It's the object name. So I want this to fill out the entire space. But I also want it to be centered. So that looks all right. I think I want that to be bold and probably a slightly larger font. That looks good. So that's my object name panel. Now that, just want to adjust my sizings here. That's going to be about 75, I reckon. And because our name here, we can center it vertically as well. So that looks good. So we've got our name. We don't need that panel to have an image anymore. Our interactable here, our UI, we're also going to get rid of the Raycaster, because this one we don't want any raycasting to be happening with it. It's purely for display purposes. So that's cool. We've got a name. Then let's set up, and we'll turn the image back on just for now, just because what I want to put in is another panel. This one's going to be down the bottom. And this one is going to have our interact prompt. So this one, 75 is probably good for that as well. So this one is going to be the input panel. And what I'll have here is I will have a bit of text, input prompt. Make this fill out the entire area. And again, center horizontally and vertically. And this might be press E to, and then we'll have some particular verb. So verb here. So that tells me probably want to reduce the size of this a little bit. So this will allow us to have things like where we could change this to be, okay, press E to pick up, press E to turn off, change station, things like that. We might also turn on the auto sizing option. Max size, I think, is going to need to be 32, but allow it to shrink a little bit. That way then, if we did end up with much longer text, we can reduce the size as needed. So that looks good. So I've got that panel, which is 75, this panel at 75, and I just add in my final one, which will hold the description. So we're going to set up another panel in here, and this is my description panel. And we can just set, 75 for each of these. And then now I'll go and turn all these images off. I can actually remove them, I won't be needing them. And then the description panel, another Text Mesh Pro, have it fill out the area. Make it italics, and I'm going to reduce the size of this. Item description will go here. And this one, I'm happy to leave that as being sort of left aligned and aligned also to the top. I think that will look okay for that. So that's good. That gives us our core elements here. And so really we're setting up just a core sort of structure for this that we'll then be able to apply to other things. So that looks pretty good. I would also like to have a thing where we can indicate if it's something that's a timed interaction that we're needing to continue holding for that particular time. So there's different ways I could go about doing that. I think what I'm going to do with this is I'm actually going to use a slider. So this is going to be activation progress. So this, I want to make this fill out the entire space. Now, we can't quite see it at the moment, and that's okay. I'm going to bring this up here, and I want this to fill out whole area like that, so it looks pretty good. Might align this down the bottom, I think will work best, because there I can set the Y pivot to 0. So that looks pretty good. Now I am going to turn off the actual handle. I don't want that to be on. And our activation progress here, this fill area, I can change the color of this. So let's make it a color that's going to stand out a little bit more. Because what this will let us do is, as we progress, we can have this appear like that. Now we do need to tweak the fill area here a little bit so that it can fully cover the whole range, which now it can. So that looks good. So we'll be able to have this slider just go from 0 all the way up to 1 as we actually fully complete the interaction. With this, we're going to turn off it being interactable. We don't want any interactions happening with this. That'll still allow us to change it, but now we can show an input that's happening for it. So that looks pretty good. I'm happy with that. One of the things that I would do is I would set up a layer for these, because we're going to need to be doing raycasting. So with that, we want that raycasting to be as efficient as it could possibly be. So that means we want to put this all into interactables, so including the children, so that any raycasting that we're doing is only happening on this particular object. So that looks pretty good. Now, what we could do is, at the moment, the interaction is going to happen with, so the raycast, what that will pick up is the mesh of this sphere. So what I would actually normally do is I usually find if I set up a collider, and a sphere collider is perfect for this, I would usually set up one that is a trigger, and actually 0 is probably fine, maybe a little bit higher. So I'd normally set up a trigger that's a little bit larger. The reason being is this way I can raycast just against the that layer, firstly, but also specifically allowing it to collide with triggers, because my object here, I can actually take this out of the interactables layer. So now all I'm doing the check with is this. So this allows us to customize the shape of this, the position of it, separate from the visual mesh. Gives us a lot more control over what's actually happening here for it. So that looks pretty good. I'm happy with that. So let's actually start setting up some of our scripts and everything for this. So again, I'm going to keep this isolated in a separate folder. So I'm going to have a systems folder. It's going to have interactables. This way, just trying to keep it nice and sort of self-contained as best as possible, so it's something where you can easily reuse it in other things. So scripts. And what we're going to have is Interactable Object. So this is going to sit on our interactable here and is going to manage that process of knowing that it's being looked at, things like that. So we've got that script on here. Now there's a bunch of things that we are going to need to be able to link to. I'm just going to have these both up so I can easily see all the different ones. So using Text Mesh Pro, just want to get this set up so that we can be able to control each of these ones. So object name, we want our description, and we also want our input prompt. And then the final one we need is our slider. So that's under our UI, the engine UI. This is going to be our activation progress. Now, I could configure all of my settings in terms of what those names are, what the descriptions, things like that are on this, and then I could have prefabs for all of those interactables. Absolutely a thing that I could be doing there. That's not actually usually my preference. My preference when I'm working with things like this is I actually like to set up a scriptable object that holds that data. The reason being is that's then easy stuff that I could put in like a database of interactable objects, potentially for spawning. So I just prefer that sort of process. I find it actually works a lot neater. So I'm going to follow that sort of setup here, where I have my interactable, we'll call it interactable config, scriptable object. So this is a scriptable object. And this is just going to have a couple of settings. It's going to have our name. It's going to have our description. And it's going to have our verb. So whether what we're doing with the thing is going to pick it up, it's going to turn it off, turn it on, different things like that. I also want to have a control for interaction time. The idea being that we can make it that it's either 0, in which case the interaction completes immediately, or we can make it that it actually has a certain amount of time. So with this, create asset menu. So our menu name, it's going to be interactables, interactable config. And we'll also control the file name as well. Interactable config. Because that means our interactable object here, we can just link it up to that config. And so then on start, for example, what we would do is, well, object name is going to be config and that's going to be the name, description, going to come from there as well. Input prompt, going to be press E2, and then our config, and we get the verb. So that's just all nicely populated. Now we're also going to need, because we want to be able to actually tilt and face our object. So I also, wanting from the UI side, I want to be able to link to a canvas group, because canvas groups allow us to fade stuff in and out, so I can have this prompt appear and disappear. So the prompt canvas, actually prompt group, and then I do also want to have a link to the transform for this prompt panel, because I want to be able to change that prompt panel, sorry, the prompt object here, so that it's able to be looking at the particular one. So I also want a rect transform for the prompt UI. It's just going to allow us to have this prompt face the player, so that we know that they'll be able to actually see the text. So that looks good. Let's get this linked up, and then we can start making our functionality actually happen. So we've got our object name, we have our description, input prompt, progress slider. Now on the prompt panel here, this is where I'll add the group, because this just, and we can turn off interactable and blocking Raycast. This will just allow us to fade that in and out really easily. So that's going to link to our prompt panel, prompt UI, link to that, and then we can set up our config. So create folder, data, and then we can create our interactables for a config. So interactable, a one-shot one. So this one, interaction completes immediately. Pick up. Whereas this one will also have a timed one. I mean, this one takes, say, 5 seconds. And this might be, analyze. Complete after timed interaction. This just means I can really quickly and easily just be like, well, okay, this is a one-shot one, and I can just drag in different ones really easily. This is also at a point where I could absolutely prefab this. What I would do in that case is I'd actually get rid of my sphere, and then I would prefab this shell and set that up in its own folder. So that allows me then I could create copies or variants of that. So this is going to be my interactable one-shot, and then my interactable timed. And so I can just move these to a different location. Now that can stay at that, but this I will change to there. And we can just easily then set up, so the way we work with this is we just have a copy of that prefab and we can create whatever our 3D mesh needs to be under it. And it doesn't make any impact on the rest of it. Keeps it nice and straightforward and streamlined. So we put a sphere under this one. Just give us a nice hierarchy for it. That's the big thing. Just makes it so much easier for working with. So our one-shot one will link up to this, and our timed one will link up to this. The other advantage of this is it means that, you know, if we've somehow messed up with prefabs or that, it's easier for us to go and change things if it's pulling all from a scriptable object. So that looks pretty good. So that should mean these won't do anything yet, but we should see them populated with the correct data, which they are. So that's good. Other thing we can actually do is on start, I'm going to take that activation progress and hide it. So game object, set active, false. Just so it's not there until we're trying to interact with it. I would also be able to take my prompt group and set the alpha there to 0. I want to have that we're fading in and out that prompt. So that looks good. We won't see those prompts there now, because what we want is those prompts only show up when we're looking at them. So, well, there's different ways for doing this, but one of the key things is we need this so that when we are looking at something, we want the prompt to appear. So let's take a look at how we can go about doing that. So what I would do is, in this case, I'm going to create a script that is my interactable scanner. So this is going to be looking for interactables. And this is something that I would actually attach onto typically the player. So what this is going to do is it's going to be able to scan for things. Well, we need to give it a range. So we want an interaction range. And that is going to be, in this case, let's say maybe 2 meters, I think, actually. We also want to be able to, with this control, what things it's actually looking for. Because it's going to be having to do a raycast, and we don't want it to be raycasting against everything. So we can set up a layer mask. So interaction mask, which initially will just default to everything, but we'll be able to come along and, actually it should be 0. We'll be able to then change what things that's looking for. So we can see here that we want to switch it firstly to nothing and then just interactables. So that looks good. So now we need it to be doing our Raycaster. So we'd do F physics raycast. Well, we know we're wanting to go from the way we're looking from the player. So what we could use is camera main transform dot position. We know the direction. It'll be the camera's forward. So we've said which way we're looking. Well, our max distance, we know our max distance. So our interaction range, have our layer mask, our interaction mask, and we want to specifically always collide with triggers. Now we also need the version of this where we get output. So that comes after the direction. So raycast hit result. So we would have out hit result. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to reorganize this so it's a little bit clearer. So now we have, this is going to be properly detecting if it is hitting something. Have we hit something? What we want to do first is we want to check if that has an interactable object on it. So we would say our hit result dot collider get component interactable object. So this is our candidate interactable. So there are a couple of scenarios here in terms of what we're looking at. We could be looking at something for the first time. We could be continuing to look at something, or we could have stopped looking at something. And we actually need to handle those different cases. So I need to here keep track of interactable object, current interactable, because I have those different scenarios. So F, candidate interactable, is not equal to null. So if we have something that we're looking at and the current interactable is equal to null. So in this case, we're looking at something new. Started looking at something, previously looking at nothing. So that's one use case. The other use case is, okay, well, if the candidate interactable is not equal to null and candidate is equal to current. So in this case, we are still looking at the same thing. The other thing that could happen is we're now looking at something completely different. We might now not be looking at an interactable at all. So otherwise, if the candidate interactable is equal to null, and we were looking at something, not looking at something previously were. Now there's two scenarios that we could hit into this. In this case, we've started to look at something else that is still in that layer, but does not have that interactable object script on it, which should generally not happen, but we want to handle that case just to be sure. The case where this will usually happen is down here, because this is where we're not looking at something. So F, current interactable is not equal to null. Stopped looking at previous, same comment actually would apply. So we have three different scenarios. Started looking at something, still looking at something, stopped looking at something. Those are the three use cases that we have. Now, there's different ways we could structure this. I'm going to actually put these down here. So on start looking at, and then interactable object, interactable. So that will apply in this case on start looking at, candidate interactable. Now, this case where we're going to be looking at something and it's the exact same as what we had before. So that we can say with this on continue looking at, and we just won't pass in anything with this on continue looking at, because that will allow us to tell that interactable, hey, I'm still looking at you. So we've got that scenario. We've got the scenario where we stop looking at things. So on stop looking at, which it also applies here. On stop looking at. I'm going to set that up here. Void on stop looking at. And we actually have one other case, because we've handled where candidate interactable is not null, but a previous one was. Candidate interactable is null, and a previous wasn't. And candidate is not null, and it's the same as before. But we could switch from, if things were really closely paced, we could actually have a scenario where our candidate one is null, and it doesn't match what we were previously looking at. So this, we are looking at something, previously looking at something else. Because this one doesn't need its own extra functions. Because this we handle as a on stop looking at, whatever the current one was, and an on start looking at, and our candidate. So by using functions for this, It just means that we've got less duplication of code, we've got a bit more consistency with the setup. So although there's lots of cases that we're handling, we're funneling our logic through some consistent, clear interfaces. Because start looking at, well, that is going to need to set current interactable to this. And I want it to tell current interactable, start looking at. Now that function doesn't exist yet, but I'm writing the way that I want to interface with it. That's a way I like to generally approach things, is write the interface of how I'm using it, and then actually write fill that interface out so it works. For stop looking at, well, we tell current interactable, stop looking at, and then we would set current interactable to null, just so we're restoring it to a proper state. And then continue looking at current interactable, continue looking at. So that's good. Let's have a look at what we can do then with setting up these functions. So void, and these will need to be public. So start looking at. We've got stop looking at. And we've also got continue looking at. So what we want to do is have the prompt fade in and be looking towards the player while it's actually appearing. So a way that we could do this is we could have a target alpha. So it's the alpha that it's always trying to move towards. So when we start looking at something, well, target alpha is 1. When we stop, target alpha is 0. And then an update, if our prompt group's alpha is not equal to the target one, then we could use a mathf move towards. So we take prompt group's alpha, we move it towards target. Now we need to give it a rate of change here. So we could have field float alpha slew rate. So if we set this to, say, 1, then that would mean it would take 1 second for it to fade in. I think we probably want it to be faster than that. It's actually 2. So we move at alpha slew rate time.delta time and prompt group dot alpha. So this is just going to adjust the fading on the panel. Just the fade on the panel. And this should mean that we can actually just test this, and we should see as we look at these ones, they fade in and out. So let's go and test this. So a bit of a distance away, which is good. We head over. We look at the ones. So we're not getting it activating yet. So that's because our interaction range, we can see it fades nicely. So that's something where, okay, well, we know we need to increase the interaction range here then. Probably a 3 for showing the prompt. And we could actually have different ranges there, 1 for showing the prompt and 1 for having it do the other logic. So it looks pretty good. Those fade in and out nicely. So excellent. So we've got that side of things up and running. Now we need to make it that it's looking towards us. So this is something where we really only want to do that if we're actually visible. So if the alpha is greater than 0, then, well, I know the thing I need to be rotating is our prompt UI there. So prompt UI, and I could actually tell it to look at. And what I could say is I want you to look at camera.main.transform, and I could give it the world up. And let's just see how that looks. See if that makes it that it's continually facing us in a way that we're happy with. pretty good. It's always rotating to face us. You can see the different ones there. So that looks good. So excellent. We've got it facing towards us now. I can get rid of this. So face camera. Now we need to actually have the interaction happen. So that means we need to look at our input. So we need to customize our input config here. So we can see we've actually already got an option here for interact, which is already currently bound to, in this case, the E key and one of the mouse buttons, things like that. So we actually already have interact happening, which means we can already hook up some code for that. And we can see, in particular, it's picking up press and release. And that's actually going to be quite important. You can see we've got similar for our jumped here. So we may already have a stub here for interact that we can reuse. But I just want to make sure, cool, okay, so this is not going to already be trying to do any interactions in the character input, which is good. So what we can do is I'm going to grab this, and I want it to be in the Interactable Scanner. So the Interactable Scanner, I want it to have on interact. So internal form interact. We need to be bringing in Unity Engine input system. So we've got access to this. Because what this allows us to do then is in our continue looking at, that's where we can then, as part of that, feed into this whether we are trying to perform the interaction. So Interactable Object can then change bool perform interaction. So what this is then able to do is we can start to look and see, okay, well, if we're performing the interaction, do we actually have an interaction time? So F, perform interaction. First check is, do we have that interaction time? fconfig so interaction time, if that's less than or equal to 0, then what we do is have something like complete interaction, or interaction completed, I think would be a better term. So interaction completed. I'm just going to return, so I'm going to exit. Are we performing an interaction? No interaction time set. Then it completes immediately. So void interaction completed. I'm going to actually set up a Unity event that we could fire. Again, just trying to make sure we've got a few useful cases for this. So Unity event systems, Unity engine, not event systems. Event, sorry. So let's have a Unity event here. So Unity event. And because I'm using a newer version of Unity event, I can actually have this pass extra info. So I could pass things like the config of what it's interacted with. For now, on interaction completed, Unity event. So then, all I need to do down here is on interaction completed, invoke. Now, maybe this destroys after it's been activated. So I could do a destroy game object. That could also be a configuration option. So I could have a bool here that controls whether it can be used. Serious field, bool, allow interaction. Because then this, I would also, just for completion, allow interaction, goes to false. And I would stub out things like this, where allow interaction, we return if it's not supporting it. And actually that I would probably do, that's better done over in the scanner here. So if that candidate interactable, allow, and actually if that's not equal to null, and just so that we can have a way of easily checking, is this something that we can continue to use? So I could set up a public bool can interact. This just lets the interactable scanner here ignore it if it's one that we can't interact with. In candidate interactable, allow can. And I'm going to force that to null. Can't interact, then null it out. That means then as soon as we've finished interacting with something, it will actually clear it out, and we won't try and perform any logic with it, which will just help with cleaning things up, which will be good. And this, when the interaction is completed, we can also, at that point, well, we can, and I would actually go for a stop looking at, just so that we reset the alpha, things like that. So everything goes back to being what we want the values to be there. Actually, we might just set the values a hard set to 0 at that point. So prompt group alpha is equal to our target alpha equal to 0. Just is going to force switch everything off. Now, we're destroying it, so we don't necessarily need to, but if you wanted to remove that destruction there, then this would allow you to do that. We also might want to not, turn off the interaction at that point. We might want to have a timed reset. There's lots of different things you could do. So just trying to make sure we've got a range of different options here that we've got available to us. So, okay, that handles this scenario where there's no interaction time set. If there is, then we need to tick that progress. So we need our interaction progress. And with our interaction progress, well, interaction progress, I'm going to increase that by time delta time divided by our interaction time. That way then when our interaction progress hits 1, we know we're done. Because we can also then check, okay, well, interaction progress is greater or equal to 1, then same as this, interaction's completed. So update the progress, check if completed. If it's not, we have that slider that we want to actually update the progress there for. So that's our activation progress. Its value becomes our interaction progress. And if we haven't already, then we want to make sure that that is visible. So we could already check if it's activation progress, game object, and if it is active, then, so if it's not, then we'll show it. Update the progress slider. Now the other thing we could then do is we could check here, because that's if we're performing the interaction, or what if we're not? Only really applies if we have an interaction time. If we have an interaction time, then, well, our progress has to actually reset. We've stopped holding down the key. That means we also need to reset our activation progress slider, and we'll turn that off as well. So activation progress, set active, false. So it just means that we're not having it stick around when it's not actually active. So let's test these out. We should have our one-shot interaction and our timed one. So this is our timed one. Let's test our one-shot one to begin with. So press E, disappears. Good. Timed. Press E, we see that increasing. If we look away, resets. If we stop pressing E, also resets. If we let it complete though, then it activates and it completes the logic. So that's our interaction system. We've got a core set up now that we could then expand in a variety of different ways. We could make it that we can reactivate things afterwards. We could make it that we have multiple different prompts that we might display. We could switch those prompts depending upon control schemes, input devices, and we could also be having other visuals happen there in terms of an effect that plays when it finishes. But the key thing is we've got this all self-contained. So our interactable setup, we have a few key components. One is our scanner. The scanner is searching for things. We do a raycast against a layer mask so that we are only checking against a smaller subset of things to make that more efficient. We're scanning for a particular range, and we're handling all the different cases of whether we are still looking at the same thing, those different scenarios. We cover all of those cases, but we wrap that logic in functions so that we can reuse some of the ones and so that we can avoid duplication of code there. We used a scriptable object for storing the configuration for an interactable, just so that it's a little bit more separated from the prefab there, and it means that we can share that data between different ones if we want. Really easy for them working with that. And then our interactable object itself, largely it's controlled with the UI side of things, of providing that feedback to the user in terms of having the UI appear and face the player, and then also being able to work with the progress. Now we did a really, when it resets the interaction progress, it just drops down immediately. But we could also, similar to how we have a slew rate for the alpha change, we could have a slew rate for the progress there, where the progress starts to drop back over time, or different behaviors there would be really easy for us to configure. So it gives us a flexible system that we can take and extend and modify and apply in other projects. So grab the system, have a go with it, extend this project or bring that system into your own projects. I've used this with the new input system, but the level of change there needed for switching it to, for example, the legacy input system, it's isolated to a very sort of narrow area. So it can easily be changed to be working with that. And while I use this with my character controller, none of the changes were actually in my character controller. It's all stuff that sits alongside. You could even apply these to AI characters. Could be using this to look at stuff and interact with things if you wanted. So grab it, experiment with it, see the kinds of cool things that you can be doing there with it. Thanks, folks. If you're looking for the code for the project, then in the description below, you'll find a link to the GitHub. And on the GitHub, I've got the code for this project and for all of the other projects there freely available. And if you have found the video helpful and you'd like to support the channel, then throwing in a like or subscribing is always a huge help. If you're looking for further ways to support, then I do have a Patreon set up, and that's going to help me keep managing to do these videos for a long time to come, which is going to help more people make cool things. And that's awesome, because that's what this is all about, is helping more people make more cool things. And that is all. Thank you.